So what we're going to be covering today, well, the objectives are really to explore the causes of student misconceptions in science and why, as teachers, it's really important to plan lessons with misconceptions in mind. And in the second part, we'll be discussing strategies to identify and address common misconceptions in science with a view to hopefully improving the effectiveness in science lessons. And I've got a question on this slide. So trees are some of the biggest organisms on the planet, but where do they get the matter to grow? It might seem quite like a straightforward question for people, particularly with a biology background. Generally, most science teachers, I'm sure, know the answer to that. What do you think students would be thinking if you posed that question to them? What are the likely answers that you would get? What we're going to do now is I've got a video which is produced by, it's a YouTube, a guy that produces a lot of videos on YouTube. It's known as Veritasium. It's a series that cover the disciplines across biology, chemistry, and physics. And they're really nice videos about common misconceptions. And he goes around and talks to people, you know, all sorts of people, young people, old people, children, asking them questions about their views on scientific ideas. What do you think? Why do you think this happens, or whatever? Predict what you think will happen here. It's really interesting to get an idea of what people think. So we're just going to watch a video, and what I want you to do is just think about where well, firstly, what is the common misconception demonstrated in the video, and secondly, where might that misconception have come from? So I'll just play it now.
Trees are some of the biggest organisms on the planet. But where do they get that matter to grow?
It's nutrients out the ground. It's that soil, really, yeah.
Goodness out of the soil, I suppose.
Comes out of the soil.
Yeah. Goodness.
Why isn't there a big hole around the tree where it's taken out all the soil?
Does it say gradually that the soil has time to recover?
Now, I think it's intuitive to believe that the tree gets most of its mass from the soil, because you can see those roots digging into the soil and they must be taking something out of there. And I mean, a tree looks like dirt and it feels solid like dirt, but it's not. In the early 1600s, a scientist named Johann Baptist van Helmont tried to figure out where the mass of a tree was coming from. So he got a pot of soil and very carefully measured the amount of soil in there. Then he planted the tree and took care of it for 5 years, making sure that no soil left or was added to his pot. And at the end of this experiment, he weighed the tree to find that it was 72 kilograms, but the mass of soil had only decreased by about 60 grams. This was pretty strong evidence that the mass of the tree does not come from the soil.
I've never thought about that, actually, because they don't really eat anything, trees.
They don't eat anything?
No.
They don't eat anything?
Water is all they absorb.
That's all they eat?
Yeah.
They don't eat anything else?
No.
That's all they eat?
Well, presumably from the water and the nutrients from the soil.
Is there anything else that you need besides the soil and the water?
I suppose that's what you need, isn't it?
To make
other than the original seed for that particular tree.
The seed and the soil and the water, and that makes this big tree. Of course, Johann Baptist van Helmont did conclude that the tree was made entirely of water. Now, while that's not correct, at least he was on the right track, realizing that the matter of a tree doesn't come out of the soil.
The sun energy, yeah.
The sun energy?
Yeah.
Are they converting energy into mass, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't
like
know.
there wasn't stuff and then there was. Like, where did that stuff come from?
Magic. I have no idea.
My question is, where do they get that mass to grow big?
Sun. Get it from the rain and the sun, presumably. Light. The sunlight.
And the sunshine.
The sunshine? Does the sunshine add mass to the tree?
You need to have sunshine.
Well, yes, they wouldn't grow without it. I don't know whether it adds mass, but they wouldn't grow without it.
Of course, the sun's energy is needed for the tree to build the matter into its branches and leaves. But the sun itself, the energy, is not matter.
Well, I suppose you've got to put air into this as well. Yeah. There's got to be something out of the,
What is it about
gas,
the air?
A gas in the air that it needs as well.
Oxygen.
The trees need the oxygen.
Yeah, need the oxygen, don't they?
And I guess oxygen.
The oxygen, of course.
The oxygen?
Yeah.
Are there
Maybe
any
the trees.
ingredients that we're missing?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide.
So would it surprise you to find out that 95% of a tree is actually
Carbon dioxide.
from carbon dioxide? Trees are
much,
largely
yeah.
made up of air.
Yeah. Surprising. Yeah.
Yeah,
That is surprising.
I need this reaction like, holy shit. So as it turns out, trees are mostly made out of air, out of the carbon dioxide that they take in. And what's interesting is that we breathe out carbon dioxide and water. That's how we lose mass. But it's the exact same substances that trees breathe in to gain mass. So if you can imagine a closed system where it was just you and a tree, you would breathe out that carbon dioxide and water, the tree would take it in, so you would get smaller while the tree is getting bigger. And in a sense, you're becoming the tree.
I think that's a really interesting video because it just shows the wide range of views that people have and the enormous number of misconceptions that people hold regarding where trees get their mass from. And you can see that actually very few people could identify that it was actually most of the mass comes from carbon dioxide. And I think that's originated from the fact that it's quite a counterintuitive idea. And students, of course, will mostly think the same, particularly when they come to school. So let's just talk a little bit about misconceptions and what they are. So misconceptions also have other names, so you might have heard of them being referred to as self-constructed theories, alternative ideas, or sometimes preconceptions, all meaning the same thing. And essentially, they're preconceived notions of how the world around us works in terms of science. And what's interesting about them is they are views that don't align with those that are scientifically accepted, those sort of theories that we all take for granted as scientists. And I think one of the really interesting things about misconceptions is that they're incredibly hard to get rid of. Even in the face of conflicting information that students might be later exposed to, students tend to hold on to these misconceptions. And that's a phenomenon known as belief perseverance. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that later because that has important implications in the classroom. Because once students have these misconceptions, it can really act as a barrier to progressing their understanding in science, essentially. So where do misconceptions come from? Well, most misconceptions are based on everyday observations, experiences, also interactions. So things like the media, newspapers, social media, textbooks, films, all of these things can contribute to misconceptions. And based on our particular life experiences, we develop our own theories about how things work, everything that we experience or come into contact with. But what happens is our brains tend to take shortcuts along the way, making for patterns and often jumping to conclusions which might not align with scientifically proven theories. And so some of the common misconceptions, this is just a list of misconceptions. Of course, there are far more, but these are just some common examples. So the first one we've put there is anything that is moving has an unbalanced force acting upon it. I'm sure a lot of you, particularly those of you that are teaching physics, will have heard of that or will come across that misconception. We've just talked about plants getting their food from soil. That's what lots of students will think. Particles expanding when they're heated, light traveling from students' eyes to the object. So all of these misconceptions are brought to the classroom. They're developing from a young age. Why do we need to address misconceptions? Well, the thing is that misconceptions can act as a huge barrier to students making progress. And Mayer and Land, I've quoted them on there, did some work in the field of economics quite some time ago, and they came up with the idea of threshold concepts. And this is relevant to misconceptions because misconceptions can prevent mastery of these threshold concepts. And what they essentially are is it's a sort of concept that can be considered as a sort of like doorway, which is why I put the image of the doorway there, a portal. And if you can master the threshold concept, so for example, it might be understanding Newton's laws or something, or understanding photosynthesis or understanding osmosis, if you can master those threshold concepts, it kind of like opens up doors to furthering or deepening your understanding in areas that are linked to that concept. And so it's really, really key that we sort of iron out these issues with misconceptions for students to allow them to fulfill their potential in science. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about key researchers and research into misconceptions. The first thing I'm going to talk about, so I'm based in the UK, so we've got a charity here called the Education Endowment Foundation. They've done an enormous amount of research. It's all based on evidence that they've gathered in terms of improving teaching and learning. Now, they've done it across numerous subjects, so it's just general good pedagogy, but actually they've also provided a number of guidance reports, and one of them is looking at improving secondary science. So the image that you can see on the left, that's the guidance report they've produced. It's free for anyone to access. So if you just did an internet search for Education Endowment Foundation, you would go to the website, and if you then click on the follow the links through, you can download that guidance report for free. And certainly in the UK, it's been very widely used by schools. It's really, really handy. And what they've done is they've looked at lots of research and evidence, and what they've come up with 7 recommendations, and they're commonly referred to pillars of good practice in science in the UK. So of those 7 pillars, the first one is actually looking at misconceptions. So one of the things a lot of teachers in the UK have been focusing on is, along with the other 6, is misconceptions. So there's lots of evidence that underpins it. This slide just shows the Education Endowment Foundation take on misconceptions. So I'll just let you read that for a moment. So essentially, it's just talking about, children have these ideas that they build about science before they start school, and yet often those don't align with scientific understanding. So they need to go through this process of adjusting their ideas, or even replacing them with ideas that are more scientifically correct. And we're going to refer to the Education Endowment Foundation further on in the presentation, and I've also embedded lots of links into the presentation, so you can just click on those links, which will come up in the later slides if you are interested in looking up or getting more information on some of those recommendations. Rosalind Driver, I don't know if people have heard of that name before. She was a really influential educational thinker. She made a huge contribution to the field of understanding in terms of student misconceptions in science. And she believed that students construct their understanding of the world through their observation and interactions with friends. And sort of through that, they created a sort of set of alternative conceptions. That's what she talked about, rather than misconceptions, but essentially the same thing, that were based on sort of common sense and their observations, but often they were wrong, even if they seemed to be logical to the children. And so Driver argued that if children are to develop a good understanding of the concepts in science, they really need teachers to guide them and help them to develop new ways to think about those experiences. And she talks about that being actually quite an intellectual leap for students, because essentially they're having to abandon that sort of the framework that they've built up in their heads and replace it. And I certainly know from teaching myself that you kind of do a lot of work to address a misconception, and then you actually realize the students have gone back to that misconception. And it's clearly very, very difficult to sort of to reconstruct students' ideas sometimes. It takes a bit of time and revisiting or coming back to. One of the things that I found many years ago when I did teacher training in England, Rosalind Driver produced a book called Making Sense of Secondary Science. And for me, this was actually one of my Bibles. So my background was in biology, and in the UK, we teach all 3 disciplines. A lot of the schools do. You're asked to teach all 3. And I was in a position where I'd only had experience of doing, chemistry and physics to GCSE and not beyond. So up to the age of 16. And yet I was then having to teach it. And so obviously I was having to brush up on my science in those areas. And that book was just invaluable because it essentially outlines all the common misconceptions in biology, chemistry, and physics. It's really well written. It sort of unpicks where those misconceptions come from, why students have those views. And I would definitely recommend that book. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it's definitely really, really valuable. So I've just put a picture of it there on the top right corner. If you wanted to have a look at that in terms of, searching for it to see if you can get yourself a copy. I'm going to talk a bit about addressing misconceptions now. And I've put 5 steps here, and this is something that I've come up with myself. This is the sort of process that I would recommend going through. And then we'll sort of break this down and talk about how you might do each step. So the first thing, I think, if you're teaching a new topic, I really think that it's worth spending the time researching and anticipating what ideas students might have when they come to your lesson. And that's particularly the case if you're teaching out of your specialism. So for me, when I started out teaching, I was having to do a lot of work when it came to teaching chemistry and physics because I needed to know what those misconceptions would have been. But to be honest, even if you're teaching in your own specialism, if you're a teacher that's pretty new and inexperienced, still you might not actually be aware of a lot of the misconceptions. So definitely worth doing the research and thinking about what misconceptions will the students likely to have. And we will talk about how you can do that in a moment. The second step, I think, is to really, when you're in the lesson itself, is thinking about, okay, let's activate prior knowledge of the topic. And so one really nice way of doing that is just literally, okay, this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about forces today. Tell me what you know about forces. Let's just do a brainstorm on the board, or write 5 facts you know about forces. Something quick, just so you know where the students are and their current understanding. And that enables you to build on that. You've got a starting point, and it helps students, really important for students to sort of hook knowledge onto the existing knowledge. So actually activating prior knowledge is really important. The third point is identifying the misconceptions. So this is the bit where you're actually carrying out activities that are actually identifying the misconceptions held by your students. And most commonly, that can be done through questioning. And we'll go on to talk about different questioning techniques and different activities in a moment. Once you've identified the misconceptions, you can then begin to sort of develop their thinking, unpick their ideas, try and reconstruct their ideas. And that, like I mentioned before, takes a little bit of time and revisiting. And finally, 5, assess to what extent your students have changed their ideas. Like we said, that sometimes these misconceptions are really, really tough to change and address. So coming back is really, really important. So within your schemes of learning or your lessons, you need to be planning, or ideally planning to revisit and reviewing those ideas and thinking about how that might inform future teaching. Now, I mentioned the EEF earlier, the Education Endowment Foundation, and this is a toolkit that they have produced for misconceptions. And so it was part of their Improving Secondary Science project, and they've called it the Radar Planning Logic Diagram. But essentially, it's breaking down the idea of addressing misconceptions into a series of stages. So the red column is researching and anticipating. Then you've got in the lesson itself, which is diagnosing and addressing. And then you've got the blue column, assessing and reviewing, which is sort of moving on into the future, what you might do differently, what you might do in future lessons. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to talk a little bit about those in a bit more detail. So the first one, research and anticipate. The things here are obviously, to begin with, really doing some research. What are the common misconceptions here? And I will actually mention that, a lot of teachers, including myself, lots of adults also have misconceptions. And so actually, if you're leading a science department, teachers shouldn't be ashamed of having misconceptions, because actually they are common and they're not just restricted to students. So I talk about identifying misconceptions, and that might apply to the teachers themselves as well. Okay, so making sure you're aware of the misconceptions. There's a bit there, the second section talks about language and vocab, and I do think that's really important, because some of the scientific terminology can be quite confusing, because we often have words in science that have a different everyday meaning. So I put a few examples there. So one of the ones that I always think is model. We talk about models in science. We might have a diagram or an image of a cell, 3D image, and that's a model. Whereas actually a lot of students will think a model is somebody that walks down a catwalk. Again, the same thing with organic. People will think about organic farms rather than the chemical meaning. Same with accelerate. And the list would go on. But I think it's really important to take the time to actually explore and explicitly talk about the different meanings of language that could potentially be confusing. And most specifications produce vocab lists. So, if you're writing a scheme of work or a series of lessons, making sure you're taking the time to explore that vocab, particularly where there might be potentially a bit of confusion, I think is definitely worthwhile. The last bit down there is links to previous topics. So we talked about activating previous learning earlier being one of the steps. Really thinking about what prior learning are you assuming has taken place. I know particularly like in the UK, and I think about the way teaching works here, is that often teachers will change. Students will experience different teachers throughout their science journey, if you like. And so sometimes you won't know what they've learned. You'll have no idea. So making sure, you might be assuming that learning has taken place, at the beginning of the lesson, making sure you're activating the prior knowledge, finding out where they are. Okay, so let's go on to the second column in the toolkit, which is diagnose and address. So this is when we're now in the classroom. We've finished planning and thinking about the lesson. Now we're in the classroom. Now we need to identify those misconceptions and think about how we're going to address them. So in terms of diagnosing them, there are lots of different activities you can do, and most of them involve questioning or methods to help students talk about their current views or thoughts in terms of scientific ideas. So the diagram I've got on that slide is actually what we call a concept cartoon. So you just have a cartoon image with the call outs, which the three call outs there, each having a different idea. And with those call outs, you would tend to have misconceptions, and then the idea that it is in alignment with the accepted scientific theory. So these are really useful, because if you present them, so ideally in a class, you would present this either on a board or on a piece of paper to students and get them to think, have a look at the diagram, have a read of the different people's ideas on the diagram. Which one do you agree with and why? I think that's the important thing. Why? Why do you agree with the driver and not the children at the back, or whichever way it might be? And you need to give some thinking time, let them have a little talk. Really good to get them to talk between themselves, and then getting them to feedback. Who did you agree with? You could do it just that they hold up their diagram, circling the one they agree with, so you get a really quick assessment and view of what their thoughts are. And that's a really quick way of identifying misconceptions. We will talk about other methods a bit later on, but that's a really nice one. Other sort of activities you might do, questions, which multiple choice questions, true or false questions. You could have a diagram, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, so I won't go into too much detail. Assess and review. So this is the final column. And this is what you're going to be thinking about more in terms of after you've had your lesson where you're addressing a misconception or the series of lessons, what you then go on to do. So obviously you should be assessing whether those misconceptions have been addressed and whether the students have been able to reconstruct their ideas. And so little things like, little quizzes, getting students to draw diagrams, whatever it might be, there needs to be some sort of assessment to make sure they've shifted their thinking. And then in terms of the review and links to future topics, which future topics build on these concepts? Have a little think about that. How could you help students make those connections? And when will you review the misconceptions? It might be a matter of making a note. Okay, this class really struggled with understanding photosynthesis. Right, when we revisit plants, we're going to make sure that we go over that again. This is just an image that, again, is taken from the Education Endowment Foundation. I've included it because they produce some really nice infographics. And so it's a nice way of it gives you a context for using that radar toolkit that I've just gone through. So you'll see the first column, the red column, is within the context of digestion, researching, anticipating the misconceptions. It lists some of the misconceptions there. They've then got the diagnose and address in the green column, and they've got an example of a diagnostic question and how to build on ideas. And then they've also then got some assess and review activities and a model that you might show to the students and sort of question them about to check whether they've got a firm understanding of digestion and which of those misconceptions might still exist and whether there needs to be any future work. So that's the toolkit, which I personally find, I think it's a really nice approach. I mean, you obviously, it would be a lot of work to do it in that much detail, but it's a really nice tool that you might, encourage teachers if you're leading a department, or even if you're starting out, you might just have a go at getting into the habit of just going through that process. This is just another infographic from the EEF, and that I just put that in there. The link on there, so that the blue font is a link. They have other infographics on misconceptions, but I just think they're really nice summary of common misconceptions. So this is the one where, how do big oak trees grow? Like the video we saw earlier. Might be really good for teachers that are teaching out of specialism, people that are new to teaching, but can also be used to some extent for students. So on the website, the EEF website, they don't cover all the topics, but they've certainly got infographics for several topics in science. So that's there if you find that useful. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through a range of strategies to explore misconceptions. So, diagnostic questioning. Now, this is really, really useful. So diagnostic question is essentially a multiple choice question, and it involves offering answers which cover the common misconceptions usually, and then the correct answer essentially. So you've got 3 distractors and then 1 correct answer. So I've given an example there, which is about the where does most of the plant's biomass come from? And then you would ask the students to select the correct answer. And then I would, if I was doing this sort of an activity in class, it might be then, you could ask students to give further information on why they've made their choice, to really unpick the misconceptions. So diagnostic questions are a really, really quick way and useful way of diagnosing misconceptions. And it might be that you could do it as an activity before the beginning of a topic, a homework activity. There are lots of, you could either come up with these diagnostic questions yourself, but actually there are already many, many made for you that you can use. And this is, again, a resource from the UK, which you can access easily. It's a collection of free evidence-informed resources. So it was produced by the University of York Science Education Group along with the Salters Institute. And they are a set of resources. It's divided into 15 topics. And each of these topics is like a big idea in science. So the first one that I've used a lot is cells in biology. And if you go into cells, it has numerous diagnostic questions that cover all the misconceptions about cells, which are obviously quite a few. So if you were to be teaching, you could go onto the website, have a look at the misconceptions, and perhaps use some of those diagnostic questions to identify. So it might be a starter activity. So you could choose. So if you go in, all of their questions are presented either as PowerPoint format. So you literally just save the slide, and then you can display that. If you've got an interactive board in your classroom, you can just display it on the board. Or you can also, you can save it to Word format as well. So it could be a paper resource that you could use as well. And it's just a really quick way of identifying misconceptions. So, and those are all free. The only thing to mention there is they're accessed through the STEM Learning website. So you do need to register for STEM Learning, which I've put the link on later on. So you just need to, provide your email address and name and school or college, and then you get a registration and login, and then you can just access all the STEM Learning resources, which are free. And they've got, honestly, a huge number of resources. And so you can freely use those and download whatever you find helpful. But the best evidence science teaching resources, I think, are really, really useful. And certainly when I've delivered training to schools in the UK, I know a lot of teachers use them. I think the only drawback is that there are almost too many resources, that it can sometimes take a bit of clicking and looking at what there is and finding out which is the one that you want to use. But certainly a really, really good place to go to get more resources for diagnostic questioning. Another area that I think is really, really helpful, or another resource I should say, is concept cartoons. So these, like I mentioned before, are just cartoon images, and usually an image that depicts a sort of scientific idea. And then you have a variety of different viewpoints around that essentially are just the misconceptions that are linked to that scientific idea. And you'll notice in that image, there's also the person at the top above the glass has got just a question mark. So it's quite nice to allow students to have their own ideas, because they might not agree with any of the other viewpoints. So you can use this to get students to think about, who do they agree with? Do they have a different idea? And like I mentioned before, it's not just what do you think, it's also exploring why do you think that. And there is a lot. If you just Google or use a search engine, and put in concept cartoons, you'll get enormous amount of concept cartoons come back that you can freely use. I always recommend a book called Concept Cartoons that was written by Brenda Keogh and Stuart Naylor. Now, they're based in the UK, but they produced a book for primary school, which is age 5 to 11, and secondary school, which goes from age 11 to 16, all on science misconceptions. And they cover all the disciplines. So they go across biology, chemistry, and physics. And they have, across all the topics, they produce a cartoon for each topic, usually quite a few cartoons for each topic. And they've all been really well researched. And not only do they produce the resource that you can then just use and use in your classroom, they also have teacher notes, which I just think are invaluable in terms of, if you're a teacher that's less experienced or teaching out of discipline, it can be really helpful to go through and firstly just have a resource made for you that will quickly identify misconceptions in the topic you're teaching, but also having the teacher notes where you can have a read through the page, familiarize yourself with the misconceptions, have a better understanding of where those misconceptions come from. I just think it's a really invaluable resource, and certainly in the UK, those have been widely used. I have to say, you don't need to buy, it saves time, obviously, buying into something that's already been made, but actually there's no reason why you couldn't just produce these yourself. I mean, I know that sometimes when I've been teaching, I've just literally, I mean, back in the day with the blackboard, I would actually, with the chalk, just quickly draw a diagram. But, similarly on a whiteboard, you could just quickly come up with your own, or just produce your own resource, electronically and print it out, or have, depending on how your students are learning, and use that, without actually buying one that's been made. And that way you can sort of really tweak it and make it more personal to your students. So I think concept cartoons are amazing, and definitely well worth looking into if you haven't used them before. I'm just going to have you, just while I have a sip of water, if you just have a quick read of this task here. So this is a refutation task, and it's just what they do is it gives a scenario, and then you ask the students which of the statements are correct. And the important thing here is getting students to explore their thinking. And obviously here it's in terms of conservation of mass, and you would tend to do it following a demonstration. And so you get the students to have a read through, watch demonstration, have a read through the statements, discuss them, and then thinking about why certain ideas might be wrong. And so essentially it's about telling students why the wrong statements are wrong. And again, those can be really, really helpful, I think, in terms of addressing a misconception. I've put on here open verbal questions that I just think it's really important in a classroom to make sure that you're using your questioning to really explore students' understanding and develop students' understanding. So questions like, what do you think would happen if we did this to that? Or why do you think that? Why have you got that idea? Or why do you disagree with that? Can you give me more information? Can anybody add to that? I think it's really important to establish a positive learning environment where everybody's ideas are valued, and students don't worry about not getting a correct answer. And if everybody's listening and everybody's ideas are valued, then students are far more likely to work collaboratively and open up about their ideas and explore their ideas, which is obviously really important for developing their understanding and having a deeper understanding. And it doesn't matter if you don't come up with the right answer. It's about scaffolding that thinking, because it's probably likely that another student in the class might also have that same answer in their head. So yeah, verbal questions or encouraging teachers to use those sort of questioning techniques is really important. This is a sort of a resource that I've used a lot. It's something that I've developed myself. You might like it, you might not, but it's something I call always, sometimes, never. It doesn't work with all topics, but it certainly works a lot with biology. So this is talking about genes and chromosomes here. So you come up with a statement, and then you ask the students, or on the table there it says, is the statement true, always, sometimes, or never? And students I would tend to use this. Firstly, I would ask students to spend a bit of time to think independently on their own, bit of thinking time. I think that's really important, right? So they're activating their thinking. They're thinking, what do I actually think? Do flowers contain genes? Do bacteria contain chromosomes? They're thinking through those ideas, and then they're thinking, I've got to give a reason for my answer. I think that's true because. They have to give a reason. And by asking them to give a reason, they're really having to think about it. Some students don't like doing that because they're having to think, but that's what learning's about, and that's going to mean that they learn something much better. And I think the key here is allowing them to do it independently, but then also allowing some discussion. The discussion can be really, really helpful. A more simple way of doing this, or for topics that don't lend themselves to always, sometimes, never, is just to have true or false or something like that. Again, I just think I've used true or false a lot because, as long as you're pulling out the reasons, it informs you as a teacher, but it also brings on, addresses those misconceptions. diagrams. Now, I put on this slide an image of whiteboards, which certainly in the UK, these are widely used. So I'm sure most people would have come across them. So just a small board that can be wiped clean. Students use whiteboard pens to draw pictures or write their answers on. And so they're a really nice way of getting asking students to sketch something or answer a question or something. They each have to do it. So they're each actually having to think for themselves and write down what they think or draw their own picture. They can do it in pairs, but I tend to do it, students do it on their own. And what's really lovely about it is that you can then, as a teacher, ask the students to hold their whiteboards up, and straight away you can see what your students are thinking. You get a really clear picture of where your class is in terms of their thinking of that scientific idea. So, for example, you might ask students to draw a plant cell and quickly hold it up, and you'll straight away, from what you see, you'll understand whether students have a good understanding of what's inside a plant cell or something like. It doesn't have to be like that. It could be all sorts of things. You know, you might be draw a model of something. It might be make a prediction. It might be write an answer. You know, it could even be a true or false, like T for true, F for false. But I think it's really powerful in that it's really quick, and it gives you an assessment of all your students instantly. And that's obviously really important to inform your teaching and where you need to go from there and your next steps. Okay, let's just go through some resources. So I'm aware that I've sort of talked through a lot of resources here. So I've put these together on this slide because I just thought it'd be useful to collate everything so that you can just click and find things that I've referred to. So the first one actually I haven't referred to, that's the AAAS science assessment. That's a website I find really useful, particularly in biology, but they also cover the other disciplines for, they list common misconceptions across the topics, and it's all based on a lot of research. It's an American website, so it's based on American students, but for most of us, we're teaching similar topics anyway. I found it really, really useful. So I would definitely recommend having a little look at that if you're needing somewhere to look for those misconceptions and doing that research before you're teaching. The number 2 is the best evidence science teaching, which I referred to as producing those diagnostic questions. Again, just remember that you have to register with STEM Learning to do that. So you'll see that if you follow that link, you'll be asked to log in, and if you haven't, it'll ask you to register. So like I mentioned before, you just need to put in your details, and then you can freely access all of those diagnostic questions, the teacher notes. They've also got progression models in terms of, you know, how to structure your curriculum. So if you were leading on science and thinking about your curriculum, they've got all sorts of things there. And I would definitely spend some time looking at that. And remember, that's the one that I said they have a wealth of resources. So the only downside with that is it's almost like it's too much. So you have to really be focused on what you want. The science teacher, science thinking resources and pedagogy, that's a website, a blog that a guy called Jasper Green. So again, somebody based in the UK. He's actually the chief Ofsted inspector, and Ofsted are the people that come and inspect our schools to keep up the standards. And so he leads the science inspections, or heads the science inspections. And he used to be a science teacher, very experienced and very well respected in the UK. And he's got some, you know, he talks about misconceptions a lot. He's also, I don't know if you've heard of him. I mean, he's certainly well known here, but he's also written this book, which is the Powerful Ideas of Science and How to Teach Them. And you can see by my numerous Post-its or little tabs there that, you know, I think it's a really good book. It's, you know, lots of science teachers here have sort of, you know, referred to it as almost the Bible of teaching. It's kind of like really well used. That I would recommend looking at, because he does talk about misconceptions a lot. So definitely worth a look. It's about £20 on Amazon. But yeah, you can easily get it. But to be fair, without even buying the book, you can get a lot of his ideas just by visiting his website. Understanding misconceptions, number 4, that is an area in the STEM learning website that I mentioned. They've just got loads of resources on misconceptions. Some of them go back from the days when we had a national strategy. So some of them go back, but like many things in pedagogy, things haven't actually changed a great deal. A lot of research and evidence, like, for example, Rosalind Driver, it still stands. And so although some of the resources might be several years old, they're actually still really useful. So there's many resources there, and misconceptions might be really useful, particularly if you were leading a science department and wanting to sort of train your own department up. 5, I put the link there for Concept Cartoons, which was the book that was produced in the UK that you have to buy into. But like I said, that might just give you an idea of concept cartoons, but you can of course make your own. And then finally, I've got there the EEF radar planning for misconceptions, that toolkit that I talked through with the different columns and going through. So I've just put that link in there so that you can quickly find where that is. Further reading, I've put the first link there is Rosalind Driver. She's done a lot of research into misconceptions, like I mentioned. I think the book is amazing that I referred to earlier, but also, she's done a lot of research. So if you're interested, definitely, I would say, she's a key person when it comes to misconceptions in science. I've put the link, the second one, which is Jasper Green, the book that I've just referred to, Powerful Ideas in Science. That's the link that goes directly to his website, where he talks specifically about misconceptions and conceptual change in science education. So if you're interested in reading up his views on misconceptions, definitely follow that link. Vanessa Kind, she's a chemist, again in the UK, and she's written a list of misconceptions in chemistry. So that link will just take you to chemistry misconceptions, but I thought that would be useful to put in because they are that very. She's a chemist. She's written about them. She's clearly very knowledgeable in the area. So I'll just put that in. If you're teaching chemistry, might be particularly useful if you are teaching chemistry out of specialism, I would say, or you've got people in your department that are new to teaching chemistry or not confident teaching chemistry. That's definitely a place to go. And I've just put the link in there for the STEM learning resources on misconceptions as well. But again, you'd have to register for that one. And so that's pretty much it. So this slide's just hopefully just to clarify that I've gone over all the things I plan to do. So hopefully we've explored the causes of student misconceptions in science and talked about why it's important for teachers to plan lessons with misconceptions in mind. And hopefully we've gone through a range of strategies for identifying and addressing common misconceptions to improve the effectiveness of your teaching. I think now it's probably time for any questions. I'm hoping that we have some questions.
Hi Heidi, thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. So yeah, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to everyone for joining us today, and thank you to Heidi for giving this presentation. It was really helpful and really interesting. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we'll be sending everyone who's attended today the webinar recording and the attendance certificate for you to refer back to, and we've posted it in the chat as well, the download link for the attendance certificate. The recording will also be available on the webinar website, and if you have any queries at all, please feel free to contact us at collins.international@harpercollins.co.uk. Thank you. So on to the Q&A. We had one question, Heidi, about any examples of particular types of questions that you might ask to your students to make it clear which misconceptions they have. So could you ask them long answer questions, short answer questions, maybe multiple choice? What's the most beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, I always think of questions being either closed questions or open questions. And obviously closed questions, you've got specific answers. So those would be like those diagnostic questions. But those are quite good in terms of they've been planned to, the distractors are all misconceptions. So those are really useful in terms of quickly getting a snapshot. If you're very much aware that your teachers are generally very, very short of time, and the idea of spending time identifying and addressing misconceptions can seem a little bit daunting when you think, oh, I've got so much to get through. I don't have time to spend 10 minutes at the start to go through some diagnostic questions. But actually, the closed questions are quite a quick and efficient method of identifying the misconceptions, particularly actually those concept cartoons. I mean, they're not actually, I suppose you wouldn't call them questions as such. It's sort of like more about who do you agree with, but that's a really quick way. I think in terms of reviewing misconceptions, some of those open questions, we often refer to rich questions, which is a question that can't necessarily be answered really quickly or easily without sort of connecting various bits of information. That those sorts of questions are better for probing deeper understanding.
I see. Thank you. So we've also had someone's asked, if you're teaching outside of your specialism and you're not sure about common misconceptions, what is the best place to start looking?
I would definitely say, so the Rosalind Driver book that I referred to earlier is really, honestly, when I started out teaching, it was just so useful. And I've met many other teachers that also used it religiously. So, I mean, I'd definitely say that's a good one. But that was a long time ago when, people didn't use computers so much. Actually nowadays, I would say that, if it's an area that you're less familiar with, either asking other people, if you work in a department, I definitely think, using the experience of your colleagues, definitely do that. But if you don't have that as an option, the internet, honestly, if you just Googled or go on a search engine and just put in misconception forces, for example, you'll get numerous things come back. There's so much online. And so I would say, and you'll soon pick out which are the good ones or which ones are sort of pitched at your level in terms of where your students are. So I would definitely say that. But failing that, I mean, the concept cartoon resources are really good. And also the best resources are, they go through the common misconceptions and they cover all of the big ideas in science.
Brilliant, thank you. I suppose also going from the previous question about posing questions to your students, that could be another way of gleaning what the most common misconceptions are.
Yeah, and so I think those resources are sort of, making sure that you're aware to begin with. That's the sort of research bit, isn't it? So that you go to the lesson with that with that knowledge in your head. Then actually the question is then sort of eliciting those misconceptions. Here are my students, what are their misconceptions? Because obviously every group of students will have had a different life experience and will therefore have different misconceptions, although there are obviously commonalities.
Exactly. So another question, what is the most effective and most time efficient method of identifying students' misconceptions at the beginning of a topic?
I really like, I keep talking about the concept cartoon, that I think that's a really quick way. You could even just put a series of statements on the board that are sort of true, false statements, or that even it wouldn't be so time efficient, but you could do a demonstration of something that's demonstrating a scientific idea and get students to predict and then explain their prediction. But I would say that in terms of time, I do think the quick-fire diagnostic questions take the least amount of time, probably. But I mean, even things like the concept cartoons might take a bit longer. But actually, it really, as a teacher, it really gives you a clear idea of what your students are thinking. And like I mentioned, unless you build on that, students won't make the expected progress because they can't master those threshold concepts without you addressing any misconceptions they have. And so it's actually worth putting the time into doing that to enable them to deepen their understanding of that scientific idea.
Thank you. So someone else has asked, Do you think that in the effort to simplify science concepts to children in in elementary schools, that a teacher might create a misconception?
Yes, absolutely. And because I mentioned before that primary teachers, and particularly in the UK, they'll often not have any particular experience in science. And so, you're teaching all sorts of subjects and not necessarily having that knowledge and understanding yourself. And so naturally, adults have misconceptions as well, and they can be passed on to students. And so I do think a lot of misconceptions come from primary school, and they go on into secondary school. And like I said, that actually a lot of secondary teachers teaching outside of their own specialism in particular will also have misconceptions. So and it's nothing to be embarrassed about. And actually, if you've got a department, I definitely think it's worthwhile spending some time exploring misconceptions and making sure that people aren't embarrassed if they they do have a misconception.
Yeah, I suppose it's important to find out the misconceptions of the teachers as well as the students.
Yeah. And also, like, textbooks are terrible really for misconceptions, because actually a lot of images, I suppose the abstract nature of science means that it's quite difficult to get a diagram that conveys all the information and doesn't cause students to develop these misconceptions. And so simplified images and things that are simplified often lead to misconceptions in science.
So sort of leading on from that, someone else has asked, are we able to use web maps or concept maps to resolve the misconceptions?
Yeah, so you could, I think the way to do it well, I suppose the concept cartoon images and concept maps, a concept map, if we're talking about a concept map, so to me that means, you have a scientific idea in the middle and then you're showing how things are linked. That can really help address a misconception because it is showing the links. A concept cartoon is better in terms of identifying and allowing a teacher to sort of have an idea of where students are in their thinking. But then after that, you then need to do the work to address those misconceptions. I mean, it can come through discussion, of course, but I would say that the primary function of a concept cartoon is to give the teacher the information about where the students are.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I think that's about all we've got time for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's been a really great session. And thank you so much again, Heidi, for your presentation. It was brilliant. And yeah, it was really, really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.